Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about the secrets of the Reformation Part 2, and the question we have is, did Carlstadt institute reforms alone at Wittenberg in Germany, the center where the Reformation began, to obey Jesus and God's law while Luther was in hiding from 1521 to 1523? So we'll jump right into it. So what do we mean that Luther was in hiding? Well, basically, he had the honor of making the famous, defiant, heroic speech at the Diet of Worms on April 17th, 1521. He knew by going there and answering to the emperor and the Catholic Church why he took his positions, all his possessions could be taken away, he could be arrested. So basically, there are two stories of what happened. You know, he was kidnapped by people who wanted to protect him, or he went into hiding on his own. Luther never cleared it up, so I assume he did it himself and didn't want to admit that it was his decision. But whatever, it's still brave to risk all of your possessions in life by making that speech. But he protected himself by going into hiding until basically at Wittenberg, where he left Carlstadt behind. All of the city council was brought over to the Reformed view through Carlstadt's work over 2 years. So now we're going to see what was going on with Carlstadt. So just to recap what we were talking about last episode, Andreas Bodenstein von Carlstadt was born in 1486, died in 1541. When Luther came there to go to school, he was 1511 at Wittenberg. Carlstadt was his professor of theology at its university. Carlstadt had, and by the way, he's a priest at the same time, so we'll get into that later. Carlstadt had been twice the rector of the University of Wittenberg. He was also canon and archdeacon of the university's church called Stifskirche. It was he who conferred a doctorate on Luther in 1512, so that's when he graduated. Luther always admitted that Carlstadt was his superior in learning. He was also an ordained priest of the Roman Catholic Church. At first, Carlstadt was the teacher to Luther, and Luther was his pupil. In 1517, so this is about a few years after Luther has graduated, they worked together on putting up the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, where Carlstadt would preach as a priest. You'll see when he changed. They debated Eck together in 1519. They both wrote Reformation, well, actually it was primarily Carlstadt, by the way. They both wrote Reformation works on similar themes in 1520. And we learned last week quickly that there was controversy because Carlstadt was insisting that the works of Jesus should be put in the canon, and Luther's going to work on a Bible and issued in 1522. So he was trying to give Luther advice of how you should organize this book and list the books out. So he was clearly saying the following in 1520 in his book on Canonicis Scripturis, 1520, section 161. You see the site there on the page, on the screen. He wrote, "The spirit of the apostles is not a guide equal or greater than the Lord. Thus Paul, within his letters, does not have as much authority as has Christ." This was very hard for Luther to accept, you'll see. But Carlstadt actually made reasonable suggestions. Just like the Jews had the law, prophets, and writings, law came at a higher level than prophets. Okay, so Moses always had a superior level to all the prophets. Then the prophets were superior to everything in the writings. Okay, so that was a tier. So he was saying, let's do the same parallel division for the New Testament. So he said it should be the Gospel and Acts were first rank, put in the second section of the Bible, the 16 epistles, which would include James, which was a thorn in Luther's side, but that was what Carlstadt was advocating. So this would also include Paul and 1 John and 1 Peter. They were of second rank. And then the third rank would be Revelation and the remaining epistles, including Hebrews, and so on. So that was the what was known as the canon proposal by Carlstadt. Now, here are the reforms that went on for 2 years when Luther's not around. So Carlstadt has this church. He's been the priest forever, and he's now preaching. He hasn't taken off his vestments right away. He's preaching this whole new way of looking at Christianity. So first of all, he preached against statues in church. If you've ever been to a Roman Catholic church, like I was a kid, You have statues of Joseph, Mary, all kinds of people, and then you have Jesus up on the cross. So you have all these images, all these graven images. So he preached against statues. That's the second commandment. So obviously he's bringing in the law. He preached Jesus is the sole pastor, and hence there's no pastors. That's why actually the term they were using early in the Reformation was ministers. So you would never have this idea that anyone but Jesus is your pastor. So that's another thing we violate. The founders. He's a founder of the Reformation. This is his view of where we should have been heading. So we didn't listen to our founders. He also preached Sabbath never was lawfully abrogated by the RCC, the Roman Catholic Church. That's the fourth commandment. So again, he's bringing us back to the law, the 10 commandments at least. He preached against the misleading practice of infant baptism, refusing even to baptize his own son. So that was a big deal. People in those days had it saturated in their mind due to Paul's doctrine of original sin, which, by the way, appears nowhere else in the Bible and is rejected, by the way, by the Eastern Orthodox because it's so unorthodox. When your child is born, they would be born in sin and go to hell if they died in childbirth or before they could accept God and all that. So this idea forced people to be wanting infant baptism. So actually taking the Protestant, the Reformed view of Carlstadt is very risky because people loved baptism. They couldn't imagine having a child and not getting it baptized. He also, as a priest, he preached against celibacy for church leaders, and he eventually got married in 1522. But we have to get to what happens in 1521 and a couple more down here. He preached against monastic vows, perhaps because Jesus said don't take vows generally. Okay, then he preached against the Mass. That's not biblical, not the way we're doing it. It should be a joint service where we have a communion. And he changed it so that people could actually receive the communion in their hands. They could pray together and so on. Although ours is an audience, leader audience format, which I don't think Carlstadt envisioned that would happen. And then, or long term, it would go away. Anyway, but here's where he did something radical. In the 1521 Christmas service, he omitted any transmutation of the body. This is the body and blood of Christ. And if you've ever been a Catholic, as the host is lifted, you're supposed to bow your head. That's got, Jesus going up there, and the same thing with the cup and all that. So you're supposed to actually believe that is actually the blood and body of Jesus Christ. So that's not what Jesus said. Do this in remembrance of me. It was an action to recall the events of Jesus' life, his sacrifice for us and all that. And this is the first time he did not wear vestments. So he didn't wear his priestly robes, and thereafter he never wore them again. And they perverted, I want to be called Brother Andrew. No, don't call me Father anymore. And we're going to deal with one specific Reformation item that we mentioned just above that he proposed, which is we need to restore the Sabbath. So he pointed out that the Sabbath's command's discontinuance was only by a papal decree. It came late in Western European history, 363 AD. So Carlstadt insisted this biblical command was still binding. Think what he's saying. If you go back in history, and there's a big well, I'll get into this another time maybe, but if you go back in history, there was no end of the Sabbath observance of the early church, okay? It makes it look like that in Acts because the word Sabbath, you won't believe this, is translated as the first day of the week, okay? Even though it says the word Sabbath, if you just look underneath where it says first day of the week, see what word you see. And what they claim, they have their defense of that. It says one of the Sabbaths. So when you count to Pentecost, Paul refers to one of the Sabbaths. You have to count a certain number of Sabbaths to get to Pentecost from one other holiday, okay? And so that's how they count them. And that's all he was saying, one of the Sabbaths. And they said, well, that must mean one of the days of the week. And it must mean the first day of the week because the number one. And we'll just read it as if it said first. I mean, preposterous readings of this, and it's in our Bible. It's not King James. Just the stuff you don't know what's going on all around you. Okay, and here's a quote from Dr. Barnes Spear in his book Life of Luther. This is a book from 1850. So he says this: Carlstadt differed essentially from Luther in regard to the use made of the Old Testament. With him, the law of Moses was still binding. Luther, on the contrary, had a strong aversion to what he calls a legal and Judaizing religion. By the way, the word Judaizer does not appear in Scripture. It was first used by the Roman Catholic Church to put down people who wanted to observe Sabbath, and they were insisting people now had to worship on the day that the Roman law required you to worship. Get this, not our God, to worship Sol Invictus. It's the day of the venerable day of the sun, the worship-worthy day of their sun god. That's why they did it, and that's why actually the whole day of Sunday was created by Constantine. It was in 321 AD. He created the weekday days so he could establish his solar religion, and then he asked us nicely, I suppose, please, you need to all worship on the day of the God of the sun. And he never changed the law to say the God of the Christians. Nothing like that. So that's the day he put us on. But anyway, the point is, okay, let me finish the quote here. Carlstadt held to the divine authority of the Sabbath from the Old Testament. Luther believed Christians were free to observe any day as the Sabbath, provided they be uniform about it. So to him, it was like, any day you think is important, go ahead, do it. But the Sabbath means you are acknowledging whatever was the traditional Sabbath, then you're gonna just rest. It's not that hard. It's like you could do nothing. God prefers that you spend time in prayer and reading and that kind of activity. But that doesn't mean you know the fundamental rule is you will remember the Sabbath to rest from your daily work. Now, why did Carlstadt put some emphasis on something so controversial? Because, I mean, you're going against the norm. Everybody who gets up on Sunday morning, goes to church, comes home. You actually expect that as a priest that everybody knows to come on Sunday. And now you're going to want to tell everybody you want to come the day before? That's a big deal. Well, the promise in Isaiah 56 of salvation and blessings for whom my Messiah would come in chapter 53 explain what God expected from the Gentiles. Two things. Have you ever heard this? By the way, the apostle to the Gentiles, Paul thought he was the apostle to the Gentiles, but it's as if he never read these passages from Isaiah, although he quotes from Isaiah quite often. So what was God expecting for the Gentiles? Keep the Sabbath from profaning it, and keep your hands from doing evil. Isaiah 56:2. And then in 56:4-6 it says, those who keep my Sabbaths and choose the things that please me and take hold of my covenant. And then if you continue, it says God promises such a Gentile will be given an eternal name. Could not be more simple, could not be more obvious. And Paul, claiming to be the apostle of Gentiles, never looked up what the duties of the Gentiles were for salvation. It's hard to understand. It's a mystery. Okay, so how did Luther respond? He insists the Sabbath is abolished. In a sermon entitled How Christians Should Regard Moses, given August 27, 1525, says of the Sabbath, again, one can prove it from the third commandment, the Sabbath command, that Moses does not pertain to Gentiles and Christians. Kind of puzzling. If you read it, you wouldn't come away saying it doesn't apply. For Paul, Colossians 2:16 abolished the Sabbath to show us that the Sabbath was given to the Jews alone, for whom it is a stern commandment. Oh, when you read it with Paul's words, you would conclude that. I get it now. So let's read the words he was referring to. Paul in Colossians 2, verses 16-17. Quote, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of any holy day or of the new moon or of the Sabbath days, which are a shadow of things to come, but the body is of Christ. Yes, so he's clearly saying you don't have to obey the Sabbath. It's a shadow. Just ignore it. Ignore it, because, if you read Isaiah 56, you might get this wrong idea that you have to obey Sabbath, because that's what Isaiah said. But, I'm telling you, I'm giving you the good news that you don't have to worry about resting on Sabbath. You can go work all day long if you want. All right, so Paul was an absolute enemy of Sabbath in the book of Galatians. So let's hear what Bart Ehrman, professor of the New Testament, explains about that. Paul is absolutely clear in Galatians that he thinks non-Jews, Gentiles, are not to do these things, that is, keep Sabbath holidays, once they believe in Christ. In fact, he lays a curse on anyone who thinks that Gentiles who come to believe in Jesus should engage in such practices. Oh, indeed he does. He actually says you're lost. By following and trying to do Sabbath, you're severed from Christ, or Christ will profit you nothing. I mean, just that whole chapter, it's all, anybody who tries to obey the law, you have to do every single command. Again, he makes no distinction because there's very few commands that actually reference the sojourners. It's usually the sons of Israel have to do this and do that. And then there's a set of commands where God will say, and the sojourner too. And then you just look those up. We do have an article on that. You know what? I'll try to do a video on that, but it's not a terribly long list of things. It's not 683 commands. It's closer to 30, 10 plus maybe 10, 15 others. And then Jesus makes some general applications of other verses in his gospel. So, you know, it's not burdensome, that's for sure. Okay. And then it's almost like Luther can't control himself. Now he's going to say Moses and the prophets are not inspired. So he can't just say, Paul tells me I don't have to listen to the law and prophets. He now has to put these things in their place. He says, Moses and the prophets preached, but in them we do not hear God himself. For Moses received the law from the angels. Oh, where did he get that from? Oh, yes, Galatians. And so has a less high order. When now I hear Moses enjoining good works, I hear him as I do one who executes the orders of an emperor prince. But this is not to hear God himself. For when God himself talks with men, they cannot hear anything but pure grace, pity, and all that is good. So again, he doesn't want to hear anything other than just grace. If you try to tell me I have to do good works, and Moses even says it, I'm not going to agree. So I'm going to make this illustration again. Between the first and the second commandment is Exodus 20, verse 6. God says, I grant mercy to those who love me and obey my commandments. It's not a loveless obedience. It's not just for obedience sake alone. It's because you love God. He knows your motivation and you're obeying his commandments. And let's just define it as the 10 commandments, because Jesus kind of did that. And two times he was asked how to have eternal life, and he said, obey the commandments. And he started quoting the 10 commandments. So it's clear we can take that premise. So Paul is saying that this law, this grace right between the first and second commandment I just quoted you, is not from God. I mean, this is what Luther's saying, and we're going to see. Does Paul actually say the law wasn't given by God? Oh yes, he says the law at Sinai was not given by God to Moses. Yes, just hold on. Okay, so in this next quote from the same sermon, he's going to now pull up the verses, which I told you were Paul bluntly says the law was not given by God, it was given by angels. So let's see this. So again, this is the sermon, how Christians should regard Moses. And so what happens here is, well, Moses said it was God. And if you read the text, it's God said this to me, Yahweh said this to me, and he gave me this command, blah, blah, blah. No. Luther's saying when it says Moses said it was God, and scripture even calls this person God, Luther says it's really meant to be angels, because Paul says this in Galatians. He revealed to us something we couldn't see before, and now we can see it. So it wasn't really God, it was an angel, and an angel, he's saying, that didn't even have God's authority, if you follow the logic. So we'll get there now. We'll listen to this quote of Luther summarizing Galatians. All right, this is a quote from Luther. Now the words which are here written in the law of Moses were spoken through an angel. Again, that's in Galatians chapter 4. This is not to say that only one angel was there, for there was a great multitude there serving God and preaching to the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. The angel, however, spoke here and did the talking, spoke just as if God himself were speaking and saying, I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's how it begins in Exodus 21 when the 10 commandments are given. So he's saying when this is recorded by Moses, it wasn't God giving it. It wasn't actually God saying that. It was an angel saying this as if he were God. And then he says, to illustrate his point, he says, it's as if Peter or Paul were speaking and God said, saying, I am your God. Wow. That's what we're supposed to understand. It's Galatians 3:19, not chapter 4. So Luther continues, in his letter to the Galatians 3:19, Paul says that the law was ordained by angels. That is, angels were assigned in God's behalf to give the law of God, and Moses, as an intermediary, received it from the angels. I say this that you might know who gave the law. He means exactly what we're going to see is meant when when Paul actually says it. So he's kind of holding that a little close to his vest. He doesn't maybe want to tell you that it's not God, but he's leaving that to be understood. Is who gave the law? If you had to study an exam and this is what you were told, well, it wasn't God. It was these angels acting on God's behalf. That's the most you could maybe assume this means. But in Galatians, it's not acting on God's behalf. So that would be jumping to a conclusion of what Luther's actually saying. Anyway, the concluding sentence. He did this to them, however, because he wanted thereby to compel, burden, and press the Jews. So Luther always has to put in there that God hates the Jews. Somehow an insult on them. They always deserve to be mistreated. And he's giving them the Sabbath command, not because he loves them, but to burden them. So he's literally giving the Jews a command to rest on Sabbath because he wants to burden and press them down. It's just mind-boggling. Okay, but the quote continues. There's a little bit more here. Again, one can prove it from the third commandment. This is Sabbath. This is how stern and oppressive God is. That Moses does not pertain to Gentiles and Christians. For Paul, Colossians 2:16, abolished the Sabbath to show us that the Sabbath was given to the Jews alone, for whom it is a stern commandment. Again, I'm just astonished that anyone could call God giving you a stern commandment when he's telling you just rest. Please don't do anything. I would love to hear from you. I'd love you to check in, talk to me, pray to me, and I'll be listening. But this even portrays God as it's kind of a bully. You know, he gives you a day off to just oppress you. What about all the other days that I'm actually working hard? Is that so? It's just the God he's imagined in his mind is something Paul envisioned. It created this impression that God was this oppressive God, even when he's being nice to you and giving you a day off. So let's go over these key verses in Galatians just so that we understand Luther isn't crazy. Galatians 3:19, the law was ordained through angels by the hand of a mediator. Okay, so where's God in this picture? Galatians 3:24 said that the law has become a tutor to bring us to Christ. Verse 25, but now faith that has come, we are no longer under tutors. It's very clear. He's saying you don't have to follow this law. Then in 4 verse 5, Christ came that he might redeem them that were under the law. So apparently, by the way, these Galatians, I think, have to be Jewish. I mean, a lot of people think they must be Gentiles, but why would he be talking this way unless these are actually Jewish people? So I actually think that's the only explanation of why he's saying is you were under the law. Okay, but let's continue. Galatians 4:8, howbeit at the time, not knowing God, now that makes you think it is a Gentile, but wouldn't it be maybe you don't know God because you're actually following the Mosaic law, which was not given by God, given by angels? I mean, that could possibly be how he's conceiving of it. Okay, howbeit at that time, not knowing God, ye were in bondage to them that are by nature not no gods. And that does seem, he's talking about the angels, they're not gods. Galatians 4:9, but now that you have come to be known by God, how turn you back again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto you desire to be in bondage over again? And elements were understood in those days when you used the word elements. Vincent explains this, and I've explained that in a prior video, that basically that means angels. So he seems to be saying it again, that you have, if you want to, well, let me continue here. He says here, but now that you have come to be known by God, how turn you back to the weak and beggarly elements whereunto you desire to go in bondage over again? So he's saying when you go try to, well, in the next verse, you observe days, O foolish Galatians. He's talking about Sabbath. So when you go back to doing Sabbath and you're putting yourself in bondage under the law, to a law given by angels, you're submitting to the weak and beggarly elements. That's clearly what he's saying. And elements is another word for angels because the angels were considered in charge of the elemental wind, fire, that kind of stuff, rain. So yeah, so Paul is just definitely has eviscerated God's role at all in the Ten Commandments and in the law in particular at Sinai. And just so you know, this is how the sermon actually begins. In the first place, I dismiss the commandments given to the people of Israel. Boom. He just gets rid of them. They neither urge nor compel me. They are dead and gone, except insofar as I gladly and willingly accept something from Moses, as if I said, this is how Moses ruled, and it seems fine to me, so I will follow him in this or that particular. I mean, that's really, I'll do whatever I want. I don't have to follow any rule, just if it's convenient to me and I think I want to do it. And any moment I want to set it aside, I can. That's me. I'm Luther. I almost can't believe how the Reformation survived with him at the helm. When you're going to see he's so upset with Carlstadt's views that he's going to have him arrested and expelled from Wittenberg, and writes a book calling The New Judas for these positions he's taken to liberate people from all these ridiculous rules. Okay, so next time we're going to cover Carlstadt's salvation doctrine and his view on predestination, and we will talk about what groups he influenced, and obviously he did influence the Lutherans because he had 2 years with Luther not around where he was doing all this stuff and creating all this controversy, but also at the same time nobody can dispute that, you know, God's Sabbath was being upheld, God's anger at using statues in your worship service, that for sure was wrong. You know, basically, and why would you baptize infants? It makes no sense. They have no faith. You know, all kinds of reform. You know, take the priests out of the robes, and they're no longer fathers, which Jesus said, "Don't call any man father." So you know, now they're just like anybody else, and we're all equal. And there's no hierarchy. There's no one above us when we go to church, except God, and Jesus is our pastor. So, you know, he created a radical reawakening of what was our relationship to God that had been killed by this formality system that you just go in, sit there, kneel, pray, say a few prayers, confess, do rosaries. I mean, it was just became a formality and not a real living faith to anybody, unfortunately. And then I was going to try to deal with Anabaptists today, but that's the group he most influenced, who basically adopted his Canonicis approach, which is Jesus before Paul, and they grew and they grew, and they're still around. I understand that David Burkott actually has some sort of affiliation. I was watching some videos where he was defending or arguing on behalf of the Anabaptists, so I suppose they're still around us. I haven't researched that, but anyway, that's the lesson for today. We're going to get to episode 3 later. Ciao, bye.